Haven't been here in several years, and as soon as I walked in, I got this burst of energy. It's really wonderful to be here. Here we are. My fascination with Otto's work began in my first year as a design student in architecture school 25 years ago. Can you hear me? Yeah. I continued to be a fascinated scholar of his work as a historian and theorist, and as you mentioned, I will write more about this in my forthcoming. And I should also mention that my thoughts on Otto's work very much come from a historian and theorist perspective. My study of Otto's work is informed by the context of the cultural, technological, and political changes in post-war Germany. I'm especially interested in the role of research institutions and scientific methods in design, and how they were a reflection of broader cultural discussions. Otto's work and that of the Institute für leichte Flächentragwerke is fascinating in this context, especially because of the unorthodox approach to research that took place in this tent. Bertolt Burkhardt once said that the IL was seen as a, quote, thorn in the side of the exact sciences at this university. One only need to check out the Minimalflächengerät, aka the soap bubble machine, to understand the level of creativity that this institute encouraged. And I think it's back there right now, right? I got to try it when I was here many years ago. I'm thus wary of receptions of Otto's work that interpret his concepts of optimization too literally, or that seek overly precise and instrumental applications of his work. I'm wary because I think this is very much against the spirit of Otto's openness and playfulness. Note that this is an inflated animal intestine. Otto was a Spinner. And if you don't know what this means, Spinner in German refers to somebody who is crazy. Otto called his institute a Spinnerzentrum. He said it was, quote, a lovingly disrespectful yet appreciative expression to describe the IL and its research. And again, views of intestines from the inside. Some people have these maybe from their doctor's appointments. And then views of animals in the zoo, and I think it's the Multihalle, right? Is it the Multihalle? No, sorry, it's a Pneuhalle. But the term Spinner is a really beautiful word because it refers to madness on the one hand, and in this case, going against the rational imperative of science and societal norms during the 1960s. But Spinnen is also something that spiders do. In Otto's words, spinners produce new threads and nets. Spinners try to find new syntheses in all fields of science, technology, and art. This experimental freedom, in my view, is one of the greatest legacies that Otto left behind. In this spirit, I'm less interested in a conventional history of how Otto was a precursor to one specific concept or another. I'm more interested in the intellectual risks that he took, in the margins and contradictions in his work, and the courage of his Spinnen. We've seen some of that in some of the previous presentations today. So today I'm going to focus on the unique ways in which Otto thought about and tested the relationships between economy and ecology. We know that he worked on many topics, but I'm trying to sort of focus it on this one very important question. This topic could not be more urgent today. On the one hand, there's the argument that societies and economies of growth are necessary and desirable. But it is clear that growth often comes at the cost of resource extraction, environmental damage, and harm to all living beings. I think that in much of Otto's work, he's trying to come to terms with questions of scarcity and abundance, of nature and technology, which are often at odds with one another. This is true in his later work, especially when Otto charted broad cosmologies of different materials, forms, and structures. I think he was trying to grapple, among other things, with the global complexities of energy, economy, and ecosystems. These are events and forces that are almost impossible to calculate and map, even today with AI and all these other things we have. And I think this is part of the open-ended project of Otto that's especially compelling and important. Ideas of economy were central to the very notion of ecology. I think it was mentioned before, the term Ökologie was first used by Ernst Haeckel in the 1860s to describe the relationship of exchange between an organism and its environment. Haeckel phrased it as the study of the economy, of the budget, in German, the Haushalt of animal organisms. Ecology and economy, as many of you probably know, also share the same origin, the Greek word oikos. These terms have since drifted apart, but one can speak of a shared preoccupation with maintaining the integrity and sustainability of a place of dwelling, from the scale of the house to the scale of the planet. By the 1960s, economic and ecological thinking had expanded to include a broader and more intricate balance of systems of environments and organisms. The threat to this balance was a serious concern in West Germany, where translations of publications like The Limits to Growth, which I recently found out was apparently partially funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, and I think, yeah, if I'm not mistaken, which that's an interesting connection. But The Limits to Growth fueled a sense of urgency. Discussions of environmental pollution, the limits to growth, and resource exhaustion were common, all the more so with the 1973 oil shock. I wish we could do this now. During the course of the 1970s and 80s, Otto became increasingly concerned with the broader impact of humans on the natural world and climate. His arguments for natural structures came to be made in favor of global environmental concerns. In 1982, he wrote, "Can man really understand nature enough so that he can act naturally? I think that if he cannot learn to do this, his existence is endangered." And this is so close to discussions that we're having now on the Anthropocene, et cetera. And we're confronted with similar dilemmas. How do we balance growth, sustainability, austerity, and abundance? Otto thought about these questions quite abstractly and philosophically, but he also tested them materially and formally. So I'm going to show you sort of 3 moments in Otto's thinking about these very complex questions. So I'm going to begin at the beginning with Otto's famous principle of lightweight structures, which he often told the story that he had discovered this while imprisoned in a French camp for German soldiers from 1945 to 1947. Otto was 20 years old when he was sent to the camp, where he was tasked with architectural work. He described a material scarcity, having to take apart destroyed tanks, or looking for a little bit of cement, as he put it, as there were hardly any materials available, but lots of time for thought and experiment. Otto often cited a proposed bridge for the Ur River, which you see here, designed from old railroad tracks, as a key inspiration for its principle of lightweight construction. Otto's recycling of materials after the war, in Germany specifically, was by no means unique. Nevertheless, the accounts of these formative experiences reveal a surprising economic principle from which Otto's work begins, the principle of scarcity. Economy for Otto was not only about calculating minimal forms, but also minimizing materials and energy more broadly. He makes reference to economy in several ways, and these all have slightly different meanings. using terms like minimum, cost efficiency, least effort, and simple. He writes of his own interpretation of the Miesian dictum, less is more. And this is after one of his trips to the United States. I learned less is more at the source, original and totally real, not only the way that it was interpreted in the USA, in other words, stylistically formal. I already had to follow the idea of less as an imprisoned architect. Less is more. This word fascinated me. Less houses, less material, less concrete, and less energy use. And this is something that I would love the US government to think about as well. Otto understood that less means one thing in an economy of abundance, as post-war America was, and another in an economy of scarcity, early post-war Germany, and of course, many, many other places in Europe. However, in the rising prosperity of the German Wirtschaftswunder, this notion of less increasingly became somewhat detached from notions of economic scarcity. Lightness became more explicitly associated with the ethical and political project of rebuilding West Germany. Otto believed that lightweight, flexible architecture, quote, might bring about a new and open society, viewing it as a response to the heavy monumentality of both the architecture of the Third Reich and the cheap concrete buildings of post-war reconstruction. Thus, in spite of many experiments with minimization and structural optimization, I think that Leichtigkeit was just as much a spiritual and ethical goal for Otto. The optimistic, airy architecture of his early work, especially that for temporary pavilions, can hardly be described as economic, at least in the conventional sense of offering pragmatic solutions to affordable building. There was an exuberance, and yes, maybe even an excess, to the construction of architecture that arguably brought more joy than utility. And I'm saying this is something that I think is good, by the way. For Otto, economy remained an abstract principle that could not be shown in accounting ledgers. In fact, Otto later admitted that there was no inherent relationship between a lightweight structure and an inexpensive structure. He explained that lightweight construction, optimized in terms of mass, should not be confused with structures that are optimized regarding their production costs. According to Otto, economy found in nature can't be directly translated into structures. He writes, the concept of cheap materials do not exist in biology. And you see examples of these. Almost all biological forms, if one wanted to technically manufacture them with their fine structures, would be unspeakably expensive. My next example considers Otto's unique thinking around architecture and energy, solar, thermal, and otherwise. Otto's fascination with capturing energy and heat from the sun began during his earliest years. In his dissertation, Das hängende Dach, published in 1954, he wrote of the house as an Urklima, a primordial climate that humans inhabit in order to survive. The boundaries of this climate are ambiguous, however. He writes, the house absolutely does not need to be a closed envelope like the skin of a balloon, nor completely separated from the local climate. It just needs to transform and improve the climate. So this could mean landscape-size enclosures, such as a cable net roof over a mountain valley, or cities in almost uninhabitable sites like the desert, the polar caps, and even the moon. The model of the climate envelope was related to Otto's idea of adaptable, anpassungsfähig building, with which he became preoccupied during his years of running the small research institute in West Berlin, founded in 1959, the Entwicklungsstätte für den Leichtbau, or Development Center for Lightweight Construction, which we've talked about a bit today. Adaptability in this context quite literally refers to an environment that could respond not just to the need of inhabitants, but also to changing climatic conditions, something that's extremely relevant today also. And this is, I think, a fascinating quote. He says, "Only the house without building materials, the dematerialized house, can be fully adaptable. I'm not able to predict if it will ever be possible to build a house without materials where we would no longer need concrete, steel, wood synthetics, or even thin membranes. Perhaps the architect of tomorrow is a physicist with a small apparatus that fulfills the tasks of the house, with which one can stop rain from falling in a certain region and wind from blowing too hard, and one can create the desired artificial climate." This is 1959. In this description, reminiscent of what might be called geoengineering today, there's an apparatus that controls the environment for human comfort so that shelter is no longer necessary. And these are the sort of Spinner ideas that I really, really appreciate of Otto's. Otto tested some of these ideas in a more concrete way in his experiments with passive solar heating. In 1959, he constructed 2 small test models to study the benefits of solar heating. One has glazing on one side of the building and the other has glazing on all 4 sides. These were placed outdoors for a year in West Berlin's Dahlem neighborhood, and each model contained thermographs to record temperature changes. And here I'm going to talk about the Martin Wagner project again. As mentioned before, a big influence on Otto's ideas of economy and ecology was the 1932 book Das wachsende Haus, The Growing House, by the socialist architect Martin Wagner. Otto published an excerpt of the book in his 1959 newsletter on adaptable architecture. Das wachsende Haus, I think the context of this is important. It was a design competition held during the economic and political crisis at the end of the Weimar Republic, which called on a number of architects, and these included Egon Eiermann, Walter Gropius, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, Erich Mendelsohn, Hans Pölzig, and Hans Scharoun, among others. I mean, it's an incredible list, to design houses that could expand or contract based on fluctuating economic conditions, something we also need in the US. Anyway, I'll stop making political jokes, sorry. Wagner's design featured an angled greenhouse. Let me show you that. It's up there on the right. Angled greenhouse facade that created a microclimate by capturing light and heat. Other entries adopted this model, like the landscape architect Leberecht Migge, who turned the buffer zone into a winter garden filled with plants. So this is Martin's plan, and you can see that there is this kind of buffer zone that wraps around the house, and this is how different architects imagine it being filled. The growing house offered an optimistic emphasis on growth and progress, even in times of scarcity, reflecting Wagner's understanding of the unpredictable fluctuations of capitalism and the global economy. The idea is basically economic downturns aren't a natural thing. This is a political thing. And with this kind of optimism of abundance, we can sort of build back towards a better society. The idea of the growing house was based in both economic and biological models, with the assumption that the two would be integrated. Wagner describes a garden that literally grows into the house, forming an edge zone of, quote, eternal spring and summer. This very much reflects Otto's vision of creating an ideal human climate through architecture. With these precedents in mind, one can view Otto's 1959 self-constructed Entwicklungsstätte für den Leichtbau as a kind of growing house. The 5 by 9 meter structure was constructed in the garden of Otto's in-laws, I hope that's correct, in the neighborhood of Zehlendorf, and consisted of a simple steel structure of round columns which carried the roof and an all-glass facade. The minimal aesthetics of the modern glass house reflected minimized energy use. Yet Otto seemed driven less by cost savings and more abstract ideas of uniting interior and exterior environment and optimizing solar heat. And so here you can see, within, you have this sort of main program inside, and then there's this sort of large buffer zone around it, which takes up almost half of the building footprint. Otto applied the buffer zone and the results of these early experiments to his own residence and studio, built between 1967 and 1969 in Wambronn, near Stuttgart. The notion of a house encased within another is repeated here, but at a much larger scale. The main house consists of a series of glazed boxes, partially wrapped by a large greenhouse structure. And like the Berlin studio, this space serves as a buffer and microclimate, becoming the outdoors for the rest of the house. In this context, adaptability refers not only to the house's programmatic flexibility, but also its ability to respond to environmental factors. Otto documented this by installing thermographs to find evidence for his theories of solar gain, which were still quite new at the time. He even referred to his house as Germany's first Öko-house. In a 1975 publication on adaptable architecture, the house is photographed at various times during the day. Oh, goodness. Oh, no. Okay. I just saw a sign that said 3 minutes. This is a little bit terrifying. Okay. Because I timed this. Okay. As if trying to capture the process of thermal exchange. Technical knowledge of the performance of the design was still nascent at the time. In this house, minimization was expressed aesthetically in the lightweight single pane glazing, even if double pane glass would have provided better insulation. In the 1970s, the house was perhaps as important for its symbolic role, especially during the oil crisis and the environmental movement, for suggesting an alternative idea of abundance, one that was different from post-war consumer culture, for example, in its generous spaces and verdant growth. One can infer that it was more than a strictly technological solution to conserving energy, but was also a social project with utopian aspirations for coexisting with the natural world. For my last example, I want to talk about Otto's more cosmological approach to thinking about energy and ecology. After the 1960s, Otto's investigations and those of this institute focused more and more on the natural sciences. And someone had asked if there's something surprising in Otto's work that isn't as known. For me, it was surprising to note how much effort was applied towards investigations of natural structures with scientists in the natural sciences working with the IL. In these experiments, he revealed a link between structural efficiency and how organisms adapt through evolution. For Otto, these were not just, structure material weren't just building parts. They were broader models of resource and energy management. In the 1980s, he wrote, physicists are focusing their research on the processes of self-organization of matter. The new concept of the synergetic inspires them. The world does not disintegrate into dead heat, but always forms new orders. He was speaking of a thermodynamic way of thinking, an energy model that rejects theories of exhaustion and disorder in favor of resilience, growth, and abundance. In this context, research at the IL focused more and more on the testing of an enormous variety of natural and man-made materials. And here I want to also give a lot of recognition to all of the researchers at the IL who worked with Otto and the important work they did. For Otto, natural materials and structures were already optimized. Nature had already gotten rid of the waste that had to be taken away. Otto began to develop a number of equations to test and compare these materials in ways that seriously deviated from industry norms. For Otto, the intrinsic quality of a material or structure was more important than how it behaved in certain contexts, even including the context of gravity. And he developed the so-called BIC formula, which is mass divided by force times distance. Over time, the IL started to form a way of graphically representing this by charting the BIC towards against what was called lambda, which is relative slenderness. This would become the basis of comparison for an unimaginable collection of stuff. Molecules, celestial bodies, bones, human hair, fluids, gases, magnets, seashells, eggshells, straw, paper, or wood. He constructed a cosmology in forms and believed that the BIC could be applied to all materials without exception. In theory, the universality of the BIC allowed for the comparison of materials and structures across vast scales and diverse origins. But how could this enormous mass of data be organized? And here's where the influence of Ohm comes in, which is this development of the BIC chart. As the density of information increased, this chart of minimization ironically became a document of visual maximization. The most ambitious effort was the master BIC chart, which is one of my favorite graphics, I think, produced by Otto. Logarithmic scales were used for the two axes of the graph in order to contain the vast range of objects. If mapped into linear rather than nonlinear space, the graph would have been truly unusable, like Borges's concept of the one-to-one map of a territory. The density and expressivity of the chart is reminiscent of other experiments in notational drawing from this time, such as Daniel Liebeskind's 1979 micromegas, or scores of Ioannis Xenakis. These suggest future and past events unfolding in space, a precise imprecision of swarms of calculations and probabilities. Otto's BIC chart similarly represented the possibility of a new horizon and scale of material organization. The BIC chart was an extraordinary historic artifact produced by the IL, and it does in many ways serve as an accurate picture of complex interactions of the material forces of ecology and economy. There was clearly no universal equation in the era of globalization that could seamlessly integrate both lightness and cost. He suggested that the instability of economic values necessitated a new set of criteria, and perhaps these could be drawn from nature. These are the limits of scientization, and perhaps the limits of what architecture can do. But in my view, reaching the limits is what is needed to show the possibilities. Otto's curiosity and optimism in thinking through extraordinarily complicated relationships of economy, energy, and structure in the human and non-human world is just as valuable for the questions he answered as those he did not. Thank you so much.